Potomac, Maryland. We're so excited to be collaborating with the ABSA Network to bring you guys tonight's program. Mohebban and Fatima and Mohebban Initiative are a youth and young professional group based in the DC area. We were established in 1996, and we're currently in the third generation of the youth group. Mohebban is built on the values of the Ahlul-Bayt, and we aim to build a diverse, inclusive community for Muslim youth through the spirit of education, brother and sisterhood, and self-development. Thank you so much for attending today's program from both coasts of the US. So today we're lucky to have Sister Zainab Hosseini here to lecture for us again. Zainab has a master's degree in human development and psychology from Harvard, and she's currently finishing her PhD in developmental and psychological sciences at Stanford. Today she's going to be talking about building the psychosocial foundations of hijab. And again, we're so lucky to have somebody who's so knowledgeable here with us today. Without further ado, take it away, Zainab.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm going to connect my charger because I want to make sure my laptop doesn't die in the interim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good evening, almost good evening to folks on the West Coast, and definitely good evening to folks on the East Coast. Like Hedia mentioned, I'm very grateful to be speaking with you all tonight and inshallah having a fruitful discussion on a topic that I think is very important and also somewhat neglected in a lot of the spaces in our community. So I really hope that we can inshallah have a conversation around this important topic. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. Can I just see like a thumbs up? Can everyone see my screen? Are we good? Okay. All right. Beautiful. So today I'm going to be speaking with you about exploring the foundations of hijab and trying to take a psychosocial approach at it. I'm going to be speaking for about, I think, 25 minutes, and I really purposefully am leaving, hopefully, a portion of the time for a discussion because I really want us to try to get engaged in the topic. And I'm very curious to hear your thoughts and kind of your takes on applying some of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about. So I will be, just to kind of go over what we'll be talking about today, I'm going to start with a theoretical framework, and I'm going to build on a few theories. So bear with me as I go in the first part over a few theories that I think can be really helpful in framing the concept of hijab. This theory particularly is going to focus on the idea of self-concepts in the world of psychology and what that looks like. We're going to look at a few psychological theories surrounding it, and then also taking an alternative approach that is a little bit more comprehensive and focused on what Islam teaches us about the ideas of self-concepts. Then we're going to use that and apply that body of literature and theory and apply it to understanding the concept of hijab and thinking about the psychosocial consequences of what happens when we frame the idea of hijab through all of these different theories that we're going to go through. And in the third and final part, I want to make the distinction that in this particular presentation, I'm going to be focusing a lot more on the idea of what is hijab, how do we wrap our head around what it entails, and a lot less, essentially, I'm not going to focus on the idea of why. Why do we have to wear hijab? Why is it that Allah has decreed for hijab to be the case, etc.? I'm not going to be answering that. However, in the very end, I'm going to be sharing a few thoughts and just kind of planting a few seeds. And I really hope that you think through those seeds, and then we can have a discussion and conversation around your ideas around it, and we build it from there. Like I mentioned, the presentation is going to be pretty theoretical and full of ideas. So I'm really looking forward to, in the fourth and final part where we have the Q&A/discussion, for us to just kind of go through some of these ideas together and think through how we can apply them in our daily observance of hijab, both the brothers and sisters on the call. So let's jump right into the theoretical concepts that I want to mention and share with you. One of the most powerful ways that psychologists throughout history have talked about what determines human behavior is your idea of self-concept. So essentially thinking about how you think about yourself and answering the question, who am I What am I doing on this earth? And how am I going to navigate this world depending on how I think about who I am? This is a really powerful question to ask, because while it just kind of seems like some philosophical question, every single day, all the actions that you take on a daily basis are informed by how you think about who you are as a person. So in psychological theories, wow, that looks really grainy, but in psychological theories, usually, historically, psychologists have divided your sense of people's way of thinking about their sense of self between two different approaches. Some people, and this is predominantly has been found among folks who are in Western societies, tend to have a notion of independent selves. The way they think about their sense of self, the way they think about just who they are as a person is through the lens of an independent individual person. They situate themselves at the center of their universe. And then a lot of the other people, regardless of how close or far they are from them, are kind of adjacent to where they are. But as you can see, there are these clear boundaries around who the person is and then who other people are. And I'm going to go in depth into what this looks like, but bear with me as I go over these two ideas. The alternative to having an independent sense of self is the interdependent sense of self. So you're kind of still at the center of your universe. But what's happening is that a lot of these boundaries are more, they're a lot more enmeshed, in that who you are as a person is very much connected to all the people who are around you. And who you are at the center of the universe is not just you. You're not the only one who's at the center of your universe. You're connected and intertwined with a lot of other people around you. So what does that look like? An example of that would be folks who are have an independent idea of who they are, typically tend to value themselves being people who are very agentic. They have a lot of power in determining what happens in their life. It is them and their efforts and their whatever it is that they do in their life and all of their hard work that goes into building what happens in their lives. People who have more interdependent ideas of who they are think of themselves in the context of a larger whole, as part of a larger group, whether it's with a community, with a family, or in a lot of studies that have been done with a whole society. So I'm going to use this as an example. Let's think of turtles for a second. In the case of this particular turtle, I'm thinking of this in the frame of an independent self-construal or self-concept, in that this turtle is thinking of him or herself as driving what is happening in his life. He's at the center of his universe. He's putting a lot of hard work, and he's the one who's guiding the ship. He's the person he's the one who's kind of like moving the show. He's powerful. Alternatively, we have this other family of turtles who if you look at the turtle at the top, he's still kind of a part of this journey of wherever these turtles are going rather slowly, but he's a part of this larger group of turtles who are moving together. He's not necessarily the only influence in where he's going. Maybe he's guiding, maybe he's kind of seeing the direction, but he's not necessarily the only guide. There is a larger group and he's one with the larger group. So let's think a little bit about what happens when people have these two different self-concepts. What are some of the things we have learned in the psychological literature about what happens to people who have these two different kinds of worldviews? The first really important question to ask is, how does that impact how people value things? What are the things that people who are independent versus interdependent value? Folks who are independent and have this independent self-concept typically tend to value having a lot of agency, so being super powerful and influential in what happens in their lives and their hard work paying off. They tend to value being able to influence others versus being influenced. So they want their voice to be heard. They want to be able to express themselves and express their emotions. They like to lead, or they value leading, even if they are folks who personally don't have the personality to lead. They value the idea of leading, and they value being heard. Your voice, it just needs to be out there, and you need to be influencing folks who are out there. This typically has been found to be the case in a lot of Western contexts. And it's usually juxtaposed, or people tend to look at it in relation to interdependent worldviews that exist a lot more in Eastern societies, including countries like Japan, Hong Kong, mainland China, and then fewer studies have been done in like India and the Middle East. But the idea is that in those parts of the world, people think of themselves as part of a larger collective. So they're not always thinking, I am the one who's doing this. I am the one who's driving what happens in my life. They tend to think more in groups. So our group together has decided that this is what we're going to doing. They're not necessarily valuing influencing others, but adapting to a situation that is happening for the purpose of the group. They don't necessarily value leading and are okay with following. These are some studies that have found these, and that they value the idea of hearing others a lot more than being the ones who are heard. So what does this mean in terms of their preferences? The only thing that I want you to take from this part is that there are so many studies that have been done on these different various kinds of self-concepts, but from the most granular system in the human body, places like your visual systems, studies have shown that there's a difference between the way that folks who are independent versus interdependent look at screens and identify items on a screen. So the way your visual system works can be predicted by whether you have an independent versus interdependent worldview. And then it goes to much larger issues like the way you choose friends and the kinds of friends that you value and the kinds of friends that you prefer. But the point is that it impacts your world. Now I want to propose an alternative worldview. So I want us to pivot for a second. I just discussed the two most popular ideas of self-concepts that exist in the world of psychological sciences. But I want to present an alternative worldview that doesn't necessarily situate the self at the center of the universe. And I'm going to try to build on some ayahs from the Quran to do this. So we're going to pivot for a second. We're going to keep that on the side of our mind, knowing that those are some of the works that have been done by large bodies of psychological literature, but we're going to now consider an alternative worldview. So the first ayah that I want to refer to is in Surah Baqarah, ayah 30, where Allah notes that Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. He refers to humans as his khalifa. Again, in Surah Naml, ayah 62, again, he talks about how وَيَجْعَلُكُمْ خُلَفَاءَ الْأَرْضِ. And then there are multiple other ayahs in the Quran that refer to humans as a khalifa. What does a khalifa mean? It means being a representative of Allah. There are a lot of discussions around whether Khalifa is only referring to Prophet Adam or not, but there are notable scholars like Allama Tabatabai, Sayyid Muhammad Baqir Sadr, who argue that this isn't actually only referring to Prophet Adam, rather it's actually referring to the human race in general, to humans in general. This is a generalizable statement. And so what this essentially means is that this idea of the concept of self, in terms of who we are, answering the question, remember how in the very beginning I talked about when we want to understand what is a self-concept, is essentially answering the question, who am I? When we want to answer the question, who am I? The worldview that I'm actually advocating for and proposing is a worldview in which you think of yourself as not as at the center of the universe, but as a representative or as an extension of the divine that is at the center of your universe. So if we go back to the circles that discuss the two kinds of selves, in this model that I'm proposing, there is no self. Your sense of self is not at the center of your universe. At the center of the universe is the divine. The way you think of yourself, the concept of self that you have for yourself is defined in relation to the divine that is at the center of your universe. You are an extension of the divine. You are a manifestation of the divine. And I like to think that I am coining this theory of Allah comes first theory. I'm just kidding, I'm not actually coining that theory, but if I could, I would introduce it into psychological sciences. But the idea being that the premise of who you are as a person revolves around Allah or the divine being at the center and you being an extension of that center, understanding who you are in this world in that way. Okay, lit, that sounds nice. What does that have to do with hijab? So let's transition a little bit into thinking about what all of the theories that I just discussed, how those theories can be translated into the idea of hijab. So remember how I said that the self-concepts that you have for who you are as a person is related to a lot of how you experience the world and how you navigate the world. And hijab is an example. It's one example of one of the ways in which you navigate the world. When you think about yourself, so let's think about the different self-concepts that we talked about, and then what the reasoning behind wearing or not wearing a hijab comes from. Just remember, we're thinking about reasoning for behaviors. From an independent worldview, you would think to yourself, you know what, I want to wear a hijab because it just feels great, because it makes sense to me, because it has personal benefits, because you know what, my hijab, my choice. It's a choice that I am making because I am deciding that I am really great. And so I want to be the one who's observing whatever it is that I'm observing. From this worldview, you're the center and you're determining this is what I want to do. And so I'm going to do it because I said I'm going to do it. The alternative from an interdependent worldview would sound something like, I'm going to wear hijab so that other people don't sin, or because I want to make sure that there's like peace and I don't want to rock the boat. And so I don't want to rock the boat in my community. Whether it, again, remember, we're talking about whether it's to like observe the hijab or not observe the hijab. The idea is that you're thinking about in this interdependent way where you're worried about rocking the boat and altering the peace of the community to which you belong. And what I want to point your attention to is that we know we know that the concept of hijab is a controversial one, in that a lot of times there's a lot of ideas and opinions and thoughts, whether internal or external, about whether hijab is a good idea or not, and whether you should do it or you shouldn't do it. And they sound something like, why isn't your hijab complete? Why are you trying to attract so much attention? Why is your hair showing? Or you're not attracting enough attention. Where's your freedom? You look so much prettier without it. There comments around the idea of observing hijab is plentiful. They happen all the times, and they are an inevitable part of a person who chooses to observe hijab. What I want to argue is that if you understand the idea of hijab through these two different worldviews that I just talked about, they can have a variety of different kinds of negative psychosocial consequences for people who are observing it. So if you are thinking of yourself, if you're choosing to observe the hijab through some independent or interdependent worldview, when these challenges that are inevitable happen, and because let's face it, it's difficult, a lot of times the questions and these are really, really important, influential questions that actually impact a person's functioning throughout their life. There are fundamental questions like, am I good enough? Do I belong? Do other people value me? Am I worth it? Am I valued at all because of my choice in observing the hijab? And this can impact a whole lot of things that range from your sense of self-esteem, your sense of belonging to your community, school, family, your sense of self-worth, trust in the important people in your life, your identity development, and then a sense of isolation and connectedness with other people and experiences with judgment. So it places you at a place that is a lot more vulnerable and at a lot more at risk of experiencing these negative psychosocial consequences when our understanding of hijab is rooted in these more independent or interdependent ideas where your sense of self is situated at the center of the universe. The alternative that I would like to propose and that I would like for us to think about is that when your understanding of who you are as a person, your sense of identity, your sense of how you are navigating the world comes from being situated around the divine being at the center of your universe. Your back, your dependence is not necessarily on yourself, is no longer on yourself and on your sense of self being strong enough. It's dependent on the divine that is at the center of your universe. If the reasoning for why you are doing something, if the purpose that you have for engaging in something is rooted in this self-concept of being a representative of the divine, The way you understand and frame the behaviors that you engage in and the actions that you take a different meaning. It doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean that having other people share their opinions about the way you're navigating the world doesn't hurt, but it means that it has a lot less deep it could have a lot less deep psychosocial consequences for your functioning, especially throughout your lifespan. If this is something that you have a habit of from early on, or whenever you, throughout the journey that you are navigating in this world, if you learn to engage in this idea of understanding your actions as relating to your sense of self, relating to the divine, it becomes a lot more difficult to shake and shatter the reasons and the ideas behind why it is that you're engaging in something that, let's face it, is difficult. So I think in just kind of transitioning into this third part that I wanted to touch on, I want to remind you that I'm not necessarily focusing on answering all of the questions relating to why is it that Allah has decreed for us to wear a hijab, or what does an adequate hijab look like? What does the observance of hijab look like? I'm not tackling those issues in this particular part of the presentation. I'm happy for us to discuss it in the discussion section. But I would like to close, which is going to take a hot second to close, but I would like to close with this third idea by planting a few seeds around the idea of what could be some of the wisdoms and purposes behind the idea of hijab. So I'm going to take a step back again, and I'm going to not be referring for a second about the concept of hijab as a physical piece of cloth that is a barrier and that is in observance of your modesty. I'm going to refer to, I want you to think of it through a different frame. And I'm going to do that by mentioning two ayahs of the Quran and walking through the two ayahs. So when we think about why hijab, I actually want us to go back to the idea of self-concept and think about this ayah. There's an ayah in Surah Al-Ahzab, number 72, and I think it was great that Brother Muhammad Reza read these ayahs, where Allah talks about how He says, "Inna aradna al-amanata ala samawati wal ard." He's essentially talking about how he has sent down an amana. Amana refers to a trust. And again, scholars have talked a whole lot about what does this exactly mean? What is this amana that Allah has sent down? Just think of it to this extent. Allah has entrusted, first He entrusted the skies and the earth and the mountains, and then they kind of flaked and they were like, no, we're not about that life. So then He sends it down, and he places this responsibility on the shoulders of humans. Again, scholars like Allama Tabatabai argue that this amana, or this trust that Allah has sent down, is a responsibility for humans to be protecting the amana that Allah has sent them, which is the responsibility of manifesting Allah's attributes on this universe. Hold that thought for a second. Let's move on to the next ayah. In Surah Maryam, when Allah is talking about the story of Hazrat Maryam, He actually talks about how when she was, right before she was about to find out that she had conceived Prophet Isa, she removes herself from her community. And the word hijab is used in this ayah in the context of her removing herself from her community, isolating herself from the people and the social context of her time, to move away from them, be protected behind the hijab, so that then afterwards is when the revelation occurs to her that the angel comes down and informs her that she has conceived Prophet Isa, and that conversation between her and the angel happens. The idea, and a lot of the tafasir behind this ayah argue that in this context, Hazrat Maryam had to go be protected behind a hijab so that she could be in this state where she could be this close and this near to Allah to receive this revelation. I think when we connect the two, what I want to propose, one of the ideas that I would like to propose is that when we connect some of these ayahs together, I think we can understand that perhaps the purpose, the purpose of hijab can be thought of being used in the service of protecting the amana that Allah has entrusted to men and women, in protecting and in manifesting his attributes on this earth and in seeking nearness to him. And the hijab is a tool that is in the service of making that be possible. It's a tool in the service of being protected, in the service of being entrusted by Allah. And I think that this line of thinking, I know it's a lot of connecting, but I think that this line of thinking connects with when you think of yourself and you think of your entire sense of existence as relating and as being entirely in relation to a divine, and you being the representative of that divine. You can think of hijab as a tool that is in the service of whatever responsibility that it is that you have towards that divine. So I'm going to leave you with those thoughts. I'm going to, we can let that simmer a little bit, because I know that it's a lot, and it's a lot of theoretical ideas. And so what I want to encourage you to do is in the next part in the discussion section is to think a little bit about what this looks like in your daily practices. And I'd like to end with this. I think there could be a lot of folks who are hearing some of these thoughts who are on very different sides of the spectrum or of this journey towards observing hijab. I would argue that it's pretty clear within the doctrine of our religion that the idea of observing hijab, whatever that looks like, the idea of observing hijab is this tenet that is decreed by, or that is instructed by Allah. And I think that a lot of us are on different parts of this journey as we're kind of moving towards understanding what is hijab, why am I engaging in hijab, how is this a manifestation of me acting in service to the divine. We're all across this journey. There's a spectrum, there are multiple steps in this journey, and everybody can be at a different part of this journey. And that's okay. There's room for that. This is not a black and white issue where you're either in it or you're not in it. And you're either like in the circle of trust or you're not in the circle of trust. This is a journey, and the journey towards Allah or towards the Sirat al-Mustaqim is a process. So let's make space for that. Let's make room for that. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here and encourage folks to think a little bit about what I have shared, and then start with their questions and hopefully use that as a way of being more applied into the situations that we experience on a daily basis. And I encourage us to think about this both in light of the experiences of what it's like for sisters to observe and engage in hijab, but also as well as the experiences and the responsibility of men to engage in whatever it means for them to be observing hijab. So I will stop sharing my screen now, and let's open it up for questions.
Thank you, Zainab. Okay, I have a comment, and I'll wait. I'll talk until we get a few more questions in the chat. I thought it was interesting, the last point you brought up about how hijab can be a tool for, I guess it's like a tool for protecting the amana that is like reflecting the attributes of God. And for me, I was like, okay, well, I'm hijabi, but I don't feel like I'm reflecting the attributes of God. But for me, I was like, oh, that further highlights the point to me that like it takes you a while to figure it out when you're growing up and everybody's like, no, it's just like a rusari. To realize that like hijab is not just a rusari. It's like if you don't, like when you're wearing it and you don't feel like you're reflecting those attributes, it's because hijab is like a whole, it's like your worldview and the way that you interact with the world, not just how you dress. And that makes a lot more sense in that like that would be a thing that could reflect the attributes of God versus just how you dress. So I thought that was an interesting point.
Such a good point. Such a good point. I think you you explained it a lot better in the last 10 seconds that you were speaking than the 30 minutes that I've been talking.
Highly doubt.
That's such a great example of this idea of situating the idea of observing hijab at a level that is a lot more profound and has to do with the piece of fabric that it is. And I think instead of understanding and thinking about it from this, like, you know, this piece of fabric and I'm doing it because of whatever reasons, if you think of it as first understanding who you are as a person and where you're coming from and what your goal is, even if you're not necessarily, if you're not entirely feeling like you're representing those attributes, like, I mean, they're divine attributes, it's a pretty big deal. So if you're not necessarily representing them, the concept is there that the goal for you is to be representing those concepts. That's the purpose. That's what you're kind of trying to make gains towards eventually and slowly.
Yeah, that hits on the point that I feel like I see a lot now that I didn't see when I was younger. And I wish I had, like, this was more the culture when I was younger, that now it's much more understood within like people my age that hijab is a journey. It's not like you don't start off and you stay the same in it for your whole life. And that journey makes more sense to me, and that the whole time it's like the air funny concept of like polishing the heart, like you're trying to get to a place where you're reflecting the attributes of God. I also think that this way of thinking about it makes it more it makes it more equal between men and women, because when we talk about hijab in general, I feel like even among Muslims, like it's assumed like, oh, it's a woman's thing, but like clearly like this polishing of your heart and reflecting God's attributes is a thing that applies to both genders. Okay, so Matthew Hosseini, your sister, actually has some comments in the chat. She asked first, can you be both independent and interdependent in those two models that you showed, or are they mutually exclusive?
I think that's a great question. I think if I were going to answer it from the literature, so I'm just going to depend, I have my thoughts, but I'm going to first share what the like psychological literature has shown so far. This tends to definitely be a dynamic process, meaning that you don't necessarily have to only adhere to an independent worldview and only think of yourself in the context of being an independent person. This is especially the case for multicultural folks, which I think are a lot of folks who are on this call. If you're navigating, if you're being socialized at home, for example, in an interdependent context, but then on a daily basis at school or at work or at the grocery store, you're having to think from a very independent worldview, people tend to develop these sophisticated ways of code switching and moving between these different ways of the way they think about themselves and the preferences that they have. But one really important thing, and I'm glad that this question was asked, because one really important thing that I really want to stress is that when you live in a society that value as at a societal level, so forget about what individuals can and can't do, but when you live in a society where at a societal and structural level, one of these worldviews is valued, it really influences how you navigate the world. So if you live in a society like a Western society where a lot of this independent sense of self is valued, you're going to hear a lot of choice, like things should be your choice. You should be the person who's making the choice. You should be the one who's determining what is right and what is wrong for you, and what is going to be the indication of your success, and what you do to succeed in life, and what your values should be, because you are the center of the universe. But when you keep on hearing those messages, even if at home or in other spaces you're exposed to these interdependent worldviews, it really, really shapes how you interact in your daily activities. And I think it has a lot of consequences for hijab as well, because you reach a point where as soon as it becomes something that you are not satisfied with, it immediately becomes, it just feels right to like it be something that you just choose to not engage with or just adhere to, just because it doesn't make sense.
I think that's there's also an interesting thing that was in your slide on it was about the interdependent versus dependent ideas of like hijab and why you would wear it. And one of the things that came up for interdependent is like to not rock the boat or to prevent other people from sitting, which is like its whole own problematic idea. So I just wanted to point out in case anyone was confused that like both of them have issues. And like the model that is like the most successful that Zainab was proposing is the God-centric model versus the independent or interdependent model where you are at the center. Matthew had another question. She mentioned, does everyone have this responsibility slash amana by virtue of the fact that Allah brought them into existence?
I would argue that the ayahs of the Quran support that. I mean, I would argue that the interpretation of scholars like Allama Tabatabai, this interpretation of that ayah support that. Because I obviously don't have the expertise to be making a statement like that, but we do have a lot of scholarship, like Islamic scholarship, on the idea that the idea of amana being sent down is a universal idea. It's not referring to one particular group of people, but it's an idea that has been sent down as a whole as a very clear responsibility for humans. And I think what's interesting is at the end of that ayah, he ends the ayah with something like innahu kana zaliman, okay, I cannot paraphrase the Quran, but the English part of it is that there are two things that prevents you from being able to be adequately entrusted with this amana. One is jahl, so ignorance, and the other one is dhulm, or oppression. So those two things are the things that directly prevent you from being able to be entrusted with that.
That's really interesting. I actually was just remembering something that we discussed in book club. Matthew's comment reminded me that, and then your comment on top of it reminded me that this isn't just like this concept of human beings being the ones who can attain like a high level of essentially unity with God or the universe or whatever the highest level is in the religion you're coming from. It exists in like all religions, and you see it like a lot in Eastern religions, like East Asian religions, where the wording is like the goal is to become one with nature, which we would say one with the creator for us. But it's like the goal is always to get to a spiritual point where you are reflecting the attributes of the universe that you came from, or like the being that you came from.
I'm actually glad that you brought that up, because I think that and I think it's such a nuanced point, right? There is this like subtle, it's not subtle, it's a pretty big difference, but we tend to sometimes mesh the two together. There's this important difference in a lot of those Eastern religions that value the becoming one with the creator or nature, and the way that Islam was brought down and given to us. And that's that in Islam, there's a really interesting balance that Allah instructs us to have between navigating the worldly life while being protected through the hijab, and while protecting ourselves in our relationship with him. So it's not a value in Islam for you to be isolated and be separate and separate yourself and go hide in a whatever place and meditate the whole time. It's actually a value for you to have this balance of being able to navigate very serious worldly, social, economic, political issues while maintaining your sense, this protecting behind this hijab, your sense of the sanctity that is your connection with Allah, and the sanctity that is your nearness with Allah.
That was beautifully said, Zainab. Okay, so Zamina Mithani is asking, she was wondering if you could talk about the term hijabi to describe a woman wearing hijab. It's something I think about culturally in that, sorry, the chat just moved, in that it creates a kind of in-group and a brand adopted by fashion, social media, etc., that can take away from the actual essence of hijab, reflecting divine attributes.
So I think that it's important. It's interesting because it's interesting how human beings, the term hijabi is a term that was created by humans to try to make sense of their surroundings and make sense of the world. And one of the ways in which you do that, one of the ways in which human beings tend to make sense of their surroundings is by creating categories. And when you create categories and you ascribe attributes to those categories, it makes the world feel like a much safer place. It makes it feel like you can navigate the world because you know what to expect. So when we apply that idea to hijab, it's interesting how this concept of being a hijabi is used by like muhajjaba women, but also non-muhajjaba women, men, governments. I mean, it could be used by whatever, as a way of creating a category and then ascribing and assuming a bunch of different attributes about that category, and then using that as a way of making sense of the world, which I think is, I guess it's, categorizations. I want to make sure that categorizations aren't necessarily always an issue. They can be used in the service of helping us navigate the world in an organized fashion. This is from just basic, the basic psychological tenets, right? Like when we categorize things and we understand the world through these categories, it helps us put things in order, structure things, kind of know what to expect. When we choose to ascribe certain attributes and then by virtue of those attributes, choose to judge a certain group of people or choose to ascribe whatever it is that comes to our mind to that category, that's where I think where the problematic part comes in. And that's an entirely, I would argue that that's actually an entirely, it's like a volitional thing. People choose to ascribe these attributes to, like, let's say, envision a hijabi and then think that they're like this, and then envision a non-hijabi and ascribe all these attributes to this non-hijabi or non-muhajjaba person. That part, I think, is a part where people choose to ascribe these things to them. And a lot of times they end up being in these hurtful and in these harmful ways.
I think it's important to note there also that the people who are putting all these expectations on like what a person who is hijab or hijabi or not hijabi are, like people who are hijabi are doing that too. Like I catch it in myself, and as you grow up, you like notice it more and more that you are judging everybody else who's wearing hijab by your own standards. And like, hopefully we all grow up to realize that that's not right. And that, like, for example, we see this issue a lot when there's Muslims in any kind of media. There's always an uproar from other Muslims because they're like, this is not representative of me. Mm-hmm. But I feel like we have a really difficult time, our community in general, with like accepting that not everybody's exactly like us. Just because that experience, just because what they're showing does not reflect our experience, doesn't mean that that's not an experience that has existed within our community.
I think that's very well said, in that the negating people's experiences was one of the consequences that happened when you understood hijab as being this, like, through this interdependent thing. I do think that it is important that, again, I want to go back to like the structural idea. I do think that it's important to be cognizant of how certain narratives and certain ideas of what hijab should look like, which is so intertwined with this independent worldview, right? Like this right to self-expression and this right to being able to look whatever it is that you want to look like, and da 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 da. When there's one single narrative that's structurally in the mainstream way emphasized and encouraged, I think it's important to be mindful of when that happens, even when it's like when that is the only representation of hijab that is held in esteem, and that's the only representation of hijab that's given a lot of airtime. We have to start thinking about what is the message that is being communicated by one particular way of observing hijab being the center stage and being regarded as the acceptable form of the way hijab should look like. That's a structural issue, and there's a lot that can also be harmful.
I agree. Okay. Yekta M is asking, I have a question. So you were talking about the God-centered point of view and the self-centered one. And even in the God-centered point of view, doesn't God say that we could make our own choices, right? So it's not just the self-centered point of view that people's choices, in which people's choices are their own.
Oh, I think that, yes, I hear that. And I think that it may have been a miscommunication on my part in not distinguishing between what I meant by people being the motivations behind their choices. So in the person-centric, independent, individualistic worldview, when we think of our choices, and when we think of the choices that we have, when we think of the choices that we make and what they're motivated by, oftentimes they're motivated by ourselves. Because we are at the center, the motivation tends to be us feeling better, us feeling good, us feeling like, so whatever choice that is, the motivation for it comes back to us, or it comes back to the person being at the center of the universe. The way I was juxtaposing that with the God-centric approach was that while the same divine that is at the center of the universe, he himself has given us the choice. He's the one who gave us the choice. It's not that this choice exists because I am the one who's, whatever. It's because he has given us this opportunity to make these choices in the service of, and as motivated by, growing closer to him.
Okay, Rose is asking, what is the hijab for men?
Favorite question. Just kidding. So first of all, I'm not an expert on what is the hijab for men. So I'm just going to preface what I'm going to say by, I think this question can be answered from a philosophical standpoint, a logistical standpoint, a real sociological point of view. What I would like to refer to is the ayah in the Quran, or one ayah, this is one instance. It by no means does it capture the entirety of what hijab for men entails, but it is pretty clear, and there's a lot of scholarship on why this happened. But in the series of events that when Allah discusses the idea of people observing hijab, first it is mentioned that men, the ayah preceding the ayah that talks about women observing hijab is the ayah about men observing hijab. And that entails, I'm not an expert on what the nuances of what the words mean, but my understanding of it is the lowering of the gaze and the maintaining. I think this part is really important, that usually gets sidestepped. There's an element about like the lowering of the gaze and whatever it is that you're doing about being responsible with your gaze and how you're safeguarding and protecting and hijabbing your gaze. So that's one part of it. The other part of it has to do with maintaining your, I forget what the word is, and I would love it, and if anybody would like to chime in with it, but there's a second part to it that essentially talks about the maintenance of modesty, or hijab. And I don't remember the exact word, so I want to make sure that I'm not paraphrasing the Quran, but there's a second element that is added to the, after like the lowering and the protecting of the gaze and being responsible about it. There's a second element that is a little bit more general around maintaining this level of modesty. And that's something that is clearly directly mentioned in the Quran. That's mentioned first. In the second part, there is a part that the ways in which women observe hijab are delineated. And then what's really interesting is that at the end of the verse, Allah refers to something like, he goes back to referring to the whole group. He doesn't say in that ayah, he doesn't end it by, okay, women, like this is what you should do. He refers to the whole ummah, or the whole group of men and women together to say, so these are the things that you should be doing so that you are, I don't want to paraphrase the Quran, but something along the lines of growing closer to him. But he's referring to the whole group, which tells us that this is something that is, the idea of hijab is a concept that is targeted to the group as a whole. And it does not just involve one group of people or one gender.
Interesting. Steve asked a great question, actually. If one currently has an independent or interdependent self-concept, do you have advice on how to help get to an Allah comes first self-concept?
That person, Steve, I'd like for you to cite me. You can put Hosseini 2021. I'm just kidding. After the Allah comes first self-concept. So advice on getting, let me just read the question one more time. I think one of the, I mean, I actually think there could be like a whole presentation on how one moves from the independent, interdependent ideas of self towards an Allah comes first self concept. But I think one of the first steps is the process of developing self-awareness, which is something that is actually very much valued in Islam. Even though we often think of it in terms of like a lot of clinical psychological approaches, it's actually something that way before a lot of the psychological literature that we know existed, it was a thing that was very much valued in Islam, and that was presented to us. And I think developing the self-awareness around looking at all the ways in which you have been influenced to develop a sense of self, and what that sense of self looks like, and what those preferences and those values look like. And then thinking about reflecting on and tapping into the part of you that has been entrusted to you, to try to reflect on whether those parts of you and the self-awareness that you engage in, how do they align with the Allah comes first, a divine first concept. And I think that self-awareness opens the door for engaging in a lot of the different parts that exist in Islam that we have to like abide by, anywhere from like prayer, hijab, or all these other components that exist. It comes from like, it has to be based on and come from this place of you actively choosing to take an Allah first self-concept approach to then build all of your actions and behaviors after that.
It's a lot to ask about. How do I change my entire worldview? And give me a 1 minute answer. Hopefully that can start you off, Steve, and all of us. Matthew is asking, do you think that one way men can contribute to the collective aspect of hijab is to be supportive of the women who are wearing physical hijab?
Mm-hmm. Collective aspect of hijab. I think we have to operationalize what it means to be supportive, because, and I think it also depends on women at what age. So I think the answer, like there is a more like higher order level answer that is like, yes, I mean, being supportive, that's great. But I think that it's so important to be really clear about what does it mean to be supportive to a woman who observes hijab. Who is that woman? What are the things that she may be struggling with? What is her relationship with her hijab? What does it mean to her? And understanding, creating space for that and understanding that part is a lot, like it's a preceding step to the process of being able to be supportive. So yes, I think it is important, but I think it's important for us to like think about what it means to be supportive and who is the person you're being supportive towards, just because it doesn't look the same for everyone. And there isn't one way of doing this.
Okay, I think we have time. Well, we're done now, but I'll take the last question. Noma is asking, can you comment about how slave women weren't required to wear hijab and what that meant in society at the time? And again, this is assuming a physical hijab, because there's more to hijab than just the physical covering. But.
Let's see. I think that because I don't have the historical understanding, I like to be really clear about what I do know and what I have like studied about, or what I have opinions about, or what I know about to talk and what I don't. And I think this is an area where I don't have enough historical context or understanding of the society of the time, or understanding of what the status of slave women at the time was, to give any kind of, be able to give any kind of feedback on that, unfortunately. But I do want to say to Noma that I appreciate you raising this, because it gives me some room for thought and thinking about the like what it was about, and just kind of studying about it a little bit more.
That's interesting. I think that something I could add to that, if you're going to look into this, Zainab, is that I'm pretty sure in the same vein as slave women not having to wear a physical hijab in front of their masters, which is problematic in itself. But along with that, I think there's also traditions that say that women living in a house with male servants, like male slaves, also
Mhm.
don't have to observe hijab in front of their servants.
Mhm, mhm,
Which I think then it makes sense that the female servants would not be observing hijab in front of the person they're serving, and the female people being served would not be observing it in front of those who are working in their house. But if you're gonna look
mhm.
into it, I'd say like add that into it.
I think it definitely has to be situated in like a sociocultural historical framework of the time
Yeah.
in the process of like starting again with an Allah comes first self-concept and then learning to ask questions and answering questions through that lens. So I'm going to try to practice what I just talked about myself to try to use that as a way of understanding a lot of these two issues that you guys just raised.
Okay. Farah and Roshana, this is the last comment we'll take.
Okay.
She said, is it true that women who enter university and jobs are rejected because of their hijab? How can one console one who possesses these fears? Have you experienced this? I've never experienced this.
Um, I think I would say that it is. So is the question is it true?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know what truth. I okay, if I hadn't experienced this, I still couldn't say that it's not true because it could be true of other folks' experiences. I can definitely say that I personally and individually have faced a whole lot of backlash and have missed on a whole lot of opportunities because of wearing a hijab. So a really clear example is um, my own advisor as part of my PhD program was engaging in this really awesome cool project that I really wanted to be a part of, and she straight up told me I couldn't do it because I wear hijab and I physically look the way that I do, and so I couldn't participate in the project. So this definitely does happen. Just like so, I guess if it's yes, it's true, it does occur. The second part of the question was that how can one console who possesses these fears? So it's not exactly a fear, it's a reality. It does happen. And that's, I think, why remember how, I guess I'll just refer back to that slide where I was talking about if the concept of observing hijab and wearing, and I mean, in this particular example, wearing a physical hijab that clearly manifests, is centered around anything that is not divine comes first. It could be anything, independent, interdependent, whatever other worldview you may ascribe to. It's very scary and it's very painful. And I mean, like how are you supposed to navigate a world where you don't know how you're going to be treated? That is the reality of what happens. But I think that and that's why I think it's so important for us to be really clear and upfront about why is it that we're doing what we're doing, so that when some of these potential pushbacks, if we can call them pushbacks, when some of these potential pushbacks or supposed restrictions happen, it really allows us to answer, okay, why was I doing this in the first place? Okay, I remember. Problem solved. I think it's obviously not that as black and white as I'm presenting it, but if we're able to be backed by a reasoning that is very well rooted and established, and we understand the purpose of why it is that we're doing something that is backed by an entire divine concept, those navigating those very real fears feel very different than if they are rooted in your understanding of yourself and you're depending on yourself. That's very scary.
Also, I mean, in terms of consoling, I feel like this is like a hindsight is 2020 thing, but when you've missed an opportunity, you never realize in the time that maybe the missing it was a better opportunity. Like, you know, when God closes a door, he opens a window or whatever. But then like years later, when I look at the opportunities I've lost, though I don't think I've lost any from hijab, so other people have, I look back and I'm like, oh, it's good that I didn't get that, because if I did, I wouldn't have gotten this other thing that was better for me.
Mhm.
So maybe
Beautifully
have a
said.
little tawakkul.
Beautifully said.
Okay, well, thank you guys for joining us. Thank you so much, Zainab. As always, your lectures are always enlightening. If you would like to come to my book club on Monday, we're going to be
I
discussing
would love
inequality
to.
and divorce, and you are like you're a developmental psychology expert, and you can talk about how all the sources on divorce try to talk about how like women's psychology in a marriage is like so different from men's, and that's why they shouldn't have the right to divorce, which is like is blowing my mind and I can't deal with it. And if I say something, it doesn't mean anything, but you are an expert. So if you would like to join and contribute to that, please do. Everyone else, you're also welcome to join book club on Monday. Thank you all for joining, especially from the East Coast because it's late night here. So happy to be hosting an event with the folks in California. ABSA has great events. Mohebban has great events. Please join us for more. Oh, right. There's a poll for, let me put this poll in the chat before you guys leave. You guys can take a minute to answer the poll. That would be fantastic. Okay. So
I'd like to, I guess while people are filling out this poll, I'd like to end by thanking everyone for being present and listening through. If possible, I'd like to end by asking everybody to make like a really, really special dua tonight for all of the people, especially Muslim folks who are suffering around the world, especially folks who are in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Palestine, and also the recent blast that happened in Kabul at a school. And I think it's really important for us to be just mindful in it, like at the very, very least, make dua for that. So I'd like to end by just asking everybody to keep that on your radar.
yes, thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I guess I will be excusing myself, and because we're nearing iftar time here. So
oh, so enjoy your iftar, Zainab, and everybody else joining from California. Thank you for coming again.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum.